And it's a pleasure to be here, because I think one of the things that would probably at the national level we would recognise is that there is a very important and life-saving focus on your biology, but there's less attention and less recognition of psychological factors. So it's a pleasure to be able to be here today and to talk about psychological aspects of cardiomyopathy. So I am going to dip you into the world of psychology, and I will also take you back out at the end. So if I don't, remind me to do that. Okay, these are the areas I'm going to cover. I'm going to introduce you to some very basic concepts in psychology. Some of them might be very familiar to you already. I'll talk a bit about the psychological impact of diagnosis, because I think psychologically that's an important area. There are lots of different areas I could be talking about in terms of the journey of living with cardiomyopathy, but we haven't got time. We've got 45 minutes, so I'll just focus on psychological impact of diagnosis, because I think it's a big area for people. I'll talk about distress. I will also talk about grief and loss. I'll touch on acceptance, and I will touch on what helps for people. So let's just start off with psychology. So the first step really is just to take a step back and think about our psychology, our normal psychology at different stages of our lives. So we go through different stages of development. If we just take, for example, adolescence, you can probably think to yourselves about the different psychological issues that are relevant for people, for say older teenagers. If teenagers are doing their exams, their GCSEs, their A-levels, they are making transitions from education, maybe education into work, or maybe going to college and university. Their body's changing, they're exploring their sexuality, they're moving away from reliance and dependence on their parents and establishing relationships with their peer groups. So that's just normal psychological development, and there's a lot going on. So then when you add in a physical health condition or a new diagnosis, it adds on to existing psychological issues for any one individual. So when we're thinking about supporting somebody with a physical health condition, the first thing we look at is what's going on in their lives, what are their circumstances, and what stage of life are they at. And you can, for each of you here, you can probably map yourself onto those life stages and identify where you are and some of the issues that are relevant at each life stage. Okay, let's look at a normal human brain and think a bit about our experience. So one way of thinking about our psychological experiences, we can break them down into our perception of our physical experiences. So, for example, just thinking about your experience now, I just want you to focus on your physical body and just noticing any sensations in your body at the moment. So that's your brain perceiving the experience within your physical body. And just notice what you can feel. Just notice, are you feeling energized? It's that time of the afternoon, so you might be slipping into a slight postprandial dip where you've had a nice lunch and you're relaxing. We're coming towards the end of the day. But you can just notice, you can see if there are any aches or pains in any of the joints. What's your energy level like? So what your brain at the moment is perceiving physically how your body's feeling right now. So that's one aspect of our experience. Now I want you to just notice what the mental activity is like within your mind. Is your mind very busy? Are lots of thoughts coming in? Are you thinking about how to get home after this conference, what you've got to do this evening? Is your mind quite quiet? So you can just notice your thoughts in your mind. Now I want you just to think about your emotions. If you could name one or two emotions now, just reflect for yourselves. What are you feeling at this moment? And see if you can identify the emotion and put a name to it. Sometimes there are just one or two main emotions that you're feeling in any one moment. And then the other is just being aware of our functioning, our physical functioning, what we do at any one point in time during the day, what we do day to day. So our behaviours, our health behaviours, our lifestyles. And that's how we can break down our psychological experience. Now, all of these things, all of these different areas interact with each other. So when we are understanding something through our perception, our understanding of what's happening maybe physically, we feel a physical sensation, and then we will interpret that, and we will have an understanding of what that might be. So if you feel chest twinges or palpitations, your brain will be trying to make sense of that and interpret what that is. So for example, have you had a heavy meal, and do you think it's indigestion? Or do you think that something is serious happening to your heart? And what very readily happens when you're living with cardiomyopathy or a heart condition, you go on to the next step of something's happening, is it serious? And then there's a thought sequence attached to that. And then that might impact what you do. For example, go and see the GP, book an appointment, go to A&E, not do anything, hold the thought in mind. So this is a very complex dynamic between all of these things, and it's happening moment to moment. And often we don't recognize these processes that are just taking place very naturally within our minds. And as individuals, we are in dynamic interaction with the people around us, with people in the workplace, people in the family, within the local community. And how we experience at any one point in time is very much related to what's happening in our circumstances, in our lives, within our relationships, within the home, within the workplace. So it looks a bit like that. What we're doing at the moment is just stopping and reflecting and thinking. We're slowing these processes down a bit, but often when we are busy and just moving around and managing day to day, we don't have time to stop and think about what's happening, and we probably certainly don't really think about our psychology very much. So it's a process that operates within the background. We might focus on our physical biology, but we probably don't often think about our psychology. So I'm just going to elaborate that a little bit today. Okay, so let's just take the example of perception. So you can think about, if you're living with a physical health condition, you can think about your understanding of your health condition based on the information you've read, the information you've had from your cardiology team, from your GP, from your cardiologist. So you have a perception and understanding of your health condition. Now, your perception and understanding of your health condition isn't necessarily the same as your consultant cardiologist's understanding, and your understanding isn't necessarily directly 100% connected to the biological external reality. Does that make sense? So what we understand as human beings in our normal life is that we make sense of things, but the way we make sense of things isn't necessarily accurate, factual, scientifically based, because as wonderful as human beings are, our normal neuropsychology, our normal brain functioning, means that we can often perceive things in a way that doesn't quite match reality. But we think the way we're perceiving the world does match reality. Does that make sense? So we think we understand and we think we've got it, and it's not a criticism of any one individual. This applies to me, this applies to all of us. These are limitations of our normal psychology and normal brain functioning. So it's really helpful to understand that the way we see things, the way we understand our health, isn't necessarily the way it is. So perception of your health, perception of what will happen in the future, isn't necessarily accurate or based in real-world science. So that's a really helpful, basic premise to just be aware of. And what we also know, what's shown in the literature, is that our perception of our health, there's a relationship between our perception and our understanding and the amount of distress that we feel. So, for example, in the literature, what's been shown is that people that might have a mild condition, so let's just say a cardiac condition, that the person is generally quite healthy and quite well. Now, if that person perceives it as life-threatening and very serious, and they think maybe they haven't got very long to live, based on maybe what they've read, and maybe based on what they've understood the doctor has said, that will give rise to distress. But if you line up 10 cardiologists and ask them to look at that person's physical health, the cardiologist might say, we're not worried about that person at all. But in the person's mind, they're very worried about it and they're struggling with it. And it's understandable, but it's giving rise to distress. So there's a relationship between perception and understanding and distress, and it doesn't correlate with the physical severity of the health condition. That these are different factors. And often we might not know that we're perceiving it in a way that doesn't quite match reality. So these processes aren't always visible to us. Now, the same with emotions. As human beings, we often, part of living is, we suffer a lot as human beings. We're sensitive, we're compassionate, we're thoughtful, we're loving as a species. But also part of the normal stages in life, there are lots of difficult things that we encounter across our lifetimes. Not least, probably one of the most profound difficulties we have as human beings is knowing that our life will come to an end, but also knowing that we have to say goodbye to the people that we love at some point. And that's one form of suffering, but there are lots of, you can probably think in terms of your own experiences across the years, of different difficult experiences that you've had that will give rise to distress. Now, when we're experiencing difficult, painful emotions, what can happen is that we have our best ways of coping with that distress, with those painful emotions, but those best ways of coping don't sometimes stand us in good stead. Can you think of any examples where we are coping with painful emotions and we're doing something, but it's maybe not so healthy or is not a good way of coping? Can anybody think of an example? Getting drunk. Yeah, we live in the UK. It's kind of alcohol and socialising and celebrating are interlinked. So it's an easy go-to use alcohol to help you relax and help you manage something difficult, something stressful, something upsetting. Alcohol is obviously an easy go-to. And it can help us relax, but also it can lead to its own physical health problems. It can make health worse, and also it can make our coping with our problems more difficult. If you drink a lot and then the next day you're tired and then you can't think clearly. Can you think of another example where something that we would use to manage with difficult emotions but is probably not so healthy? Yeah, definitely. That's another really good example. So, pardon? Yeah, so using drugs, like prescribed drugs and non-prescribed drugs, and chocolate. And then I think things like smoking and comfort eating. So it's an easy, when you feel upset, foods that taste nice. It's very easy to eat nice tasting foods as a way of coping with difficult emotions. So these are patterns that exist in all of us. And it's good to be able to recognize them. Now, I don't know if you've heard of the concept of thought fusion. So this is a type of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy that's very relevant to people living with physical health conditions. So thought fusion, it describes times when we are caught up in our thoughts and when we can't necessarily separate ourselves from our thoughts. And it's when thoughts are taken literally and feel like reality and feel like facts. So often we're going about our business, we're thinking about lots of things, we can be caught up in our thoughts but not notice that we're caught up in our thoughts. Here's an example of a thought. I feel like a ticking time bomb. Now the person might be thinking that on a regular basis, but might not be aware of how often that thought is in that person's mind, but that person might feel very anxious and very stressed, and that thought might be very present in their minds. And you might notice, for example, for yourself, that you have go-to thoughts in your minds. I'm not going to ask you what your go-to thoughts are, but just think for yourselves, are there any regularly occurring thoughts that link to you feeling upset or anxious? You probably will be able to identify some of them. Here's another thought that's really, really common in cardiomyopathy. I mean, probably put your hand up if you haven't had this one. Nobody has put their hand up yet. It's what underlies, and it's perfectly understandable, is what underlies a lot of stress and anxiety. If you're having palpitations or chest pain, what underlies the worries and thinking about, do I need to see the doctor? What underlies all of that is a worry that something serious might be happening, and what underlies that is the worry that you might die, and can you do something that will prevent that outcome? So there's a lot of thinking and emotion connected to that. Okay, let's just touch on diagnosis. In terms of the journey of living with cardiomyopathy, it's different. Everybody has a slightly different story. If we listened to the stories in this room, we'd hear many different versions and different experiences, but there are some themes that come out. So for some people, they will have been living with symptoms, maybe for weeks, maybe for months, maybe for years, before they had a diagnosis. And so it would be living with symptoms and maybe having investigations, and then at some point a diagnosis will be made. For other people, the diagnosis will have come out of the blue. There would have been no symptoms at all, no perception that there were any physical health problems, and then suddenly there's a diagnosis. And then generally what happens is, after you've had a diagnosis, it changes your life, because then you have regular clinic appointments, you're going to see the doctor, you might start medication, which is a huge thing. And you might have regular tests, so annual reviews or more regular, where you're having imaging, scans, you might have blood tests, you might have genetic tests. There are lots of different tests, partly to investigate, but also to support maintenance of your physical health. So keeping an eye on things, and they're very reassuring, but these tests also generate anxiety. So the time when you know you're going to the hospital to get your results, there's often anxiety before you get those results, because there's a worry, has something progressed. Now, as well as the ongoing checkups, there's also treatments and interventions. So some of you here might have had surgical interventions, and that's a psychology in itself. I think understanding the surgery that you're going to have, the risks, preparing to go into hospital, waking up on the other side after you've had surgery, and for some people who are in intensive care for a period of maybe days or weeks, there are lots of psychological aspects of that. I won't go into that today, but it's just to kind of highlight that as part of the broader picture. But also the medical procedures. You will have had different medical procedures, and you will know that there's a psychological impact of going through those procedures. Some of you might have a permanent pacemaker and know what it's like to be living with a permanent pacemaker. And how many people, well, actually I won't ask because you might not want to share, but there will be a number of people in the room living with ICDs. And what we know is that the surgical advances over the past 50 years and the technological developments, again over the past 50 years, are life extending, they've been life saving, it's amazing, but also they come with, there's a burden to, for example, the technology. So living with an ICD, you have the psychological security of knowing you've got your own defibrillator that you're carrying within your body, but also it's very stressful. If your ICD fires, if you have a shock, it's a traumatic experience. Some people are awake, lots of people are not, they don't have a conscious memory, but whatever you are doing when you have a shock then becomes, it's laid down in memory, it becomes a traumatic memory, and then anything that triggers an association with that memory, it activates that memory, and when the memory is activated, for example, you go back to the place where you had a shock, or you are near the place where you had a shock, or you're doing the activity you were doing at the time you had a shock, when that memory is activated, it brings back the emotions from that time and from that experience. And you can feel upset again, you can have, you can feel anxiety, and you can feel disorientated in that moment, which is essentially post-traumatic stress. And overall, what we're trying to, I think from a medical and a psychological perspective in services, is to support you to optimize your physical health, to optimize your psychological health, and to live as well as possible with your cardiomyopathy, but also support you to be doing the things that are meaningful for you. Okay, let's just talk a little bit about the psychological impact of diagnosis. So we know that it can be undiagnosed for a long time, there can be a long journey, but I think typically what happens when people are diagnosed is it's a combination of shock, it comes out of the blue, people feel upset, There are lots of worries and fears, which sometimes are worse when you do the reading. You Google your condition and start to read. There can be lots of distress related to that. It can be helpful to understand what's causing the problems, or actually there can be a sense of relief and a sense of control when you've got your diagnosis. So there are positive aspects to diagnosis because it gives you choices and you're informed and you're making decisions based on an informed knowledge of what's happening with your biology. But we do know that the diagnosis changes many areas of your life, including your everyday routines, but very importantly, your sense of yourself. And how do you manage that? And who do you tell? Who do you choose to tell? Do you choose to tell colleagues at work? Do you choose to tell your friends? And I think you could probably think about the process of adjustment to diagnosis across a period of years. For people who've had the diagnosis for a few years, you can probably reflect back on the time that you were diagnosed and notice psychologically what you're experiencing and how you're feeling. And then as you learn more about your condition and as you adjust and as you get used to, for example, medications, you can feel very differently a few years on. So here's just one study. It's by Dina Zitnik, and it's a recent study, 2021. In this study, they interviewed 32 people living with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and they'd all been diagnosed for at least 1 year, and they had experienced symptoms within the past month at the time of the interview. The main results from this study, they found that over time, as people had more information, they became less anxious. Some expressed gratitude, acceptance, and increased awareness about the importance of healthy routines and health behaviours. But a big conclusion from the study is that there was a need for more resources for patients and more education for healthcare professionals to help reduce the unfavourable, both the physical and the psychological effects of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And I don't know whether that resonates with your experience for the people that it's relevant to. I think in this study, there was one person, it took 26 years for them to be diagnosed in terms of that journey to diagnosis. What I wanted to really recognise, although we're talking about patients living with having your diagnosis, your experience of diagnosis and you living with your symptoms, as a psychologist, what I very much recognise is the impact of diagnosis on the people around the patient, around the person living with the condition. Because psychologically, members of the family also go through that state of shock, anxiety, distress, adjustment, and sometimes I think it's not recognised in family members. And the focus is on the patient. When the person goes into hospital systems, the focus is on the person with the diagnosis. And what we very much try to pay attention to within our services is the psychological needs of family members who are also not living physically with the condition, but they are living with the condition, and it is impacting on them. And I think it's really important that we recognise their psychological needs. Okay, this is a painting by Klimt, Austrian painter. It was finished in 1915. I think he started it in 1908. What I like about this painting is really, if you think about all of the hundreds of years, human beings, painters and poets and writers, we have to try to make sense of why do we exist on this planet. And I haven't got the answer just in case you came for it today. But why are we this kind of wonderful life form on planet Earth? And how do we make sense of being here on this planet for a certain amount of time? How does it all work? What's the point? What's the meaning? And I think artists obviously explore that as well. And here you've got Klimt. I think he did this at the age of, what would it have been? Probably 45 he would have started this painting. But what he's really representing is mortality on the left. And we see end of life and death represented on the left. But if you look at on the right, you've got the figures really, it's showing the life cycle. There's a baby, there's a couple, there's an older woman. And I think really what he's representing there is the normal stages of life and the life cycle. And the figures on the right are not consciously aware of mortality and death. And I think the way we live our lives generally day to day is that we don't think about end of life, we don't think about death. But what happens is when you're diagnosed with cardiomyopathy, you are prompted to look over your shoulder and you are prompted to, you're very conscious of mortality, and family members are then conscious of your mortality. And some of you will have had an experience where you will have lost somebody suddenly, and it will have been an untimely death within the family. So mortality is very much present within your life. And I think that's something psychologically that people are really struggling with and living with, and probably would benefit from support in relation to that area. So let me just touch on psychological distress. So this is a really big, if I could have this in flashing neon lights, this is a big take-home message. So the psychological distress that you experience in relation to your diagnosis and living with your condition is a normal response to your health problem and to difficult circumstances in your life. So partly we're talking about distress related to your physical health, but you've got other things going on in life, and you've had other things going on in life across the years. So your distress and your best ways of coping are a response both to what's happened as well as to a diagnosis of cardiomyopathy. So we can't really separate these things, but we can acknowledge them and recognize them. How does distress manifest itself? So emotionally, there's some examples. And see if there's anything that you've experienced that's maybe not on that list, just in terms of emotional responses. So a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, sometimes panic attacks, sometimes going for an imaging and then it triggers a panic attack actually within the hospital, feeling very emotional, upset. People have different ways of coping, depend on who they are. Sometimes people get irritable, very angry. You might be experiencing grief, both in terms of a loss of sense of your former health or identity, or you might have literally lost somebody within the family, and I'll touch on that. In terms of the genetics, what can come up is a sense of guilt if you feel that you've passed on a gene to your son or to your daughter, and it's not necessarily logical, but nevertheless, as human beings, we can feel a sense of guilt and a sense of self-blame and wanting to protect your children from living with these health conditions. And these are some of the thoughts that you might have experienced, that sense of feeling scared. I can't stop thinking about my heart. Am I going to die? Is a common thought that will pop up. What did I do to deserve this? If you've got an ICD, kind of day-to-day, am I going to get a shock, have any kind of sensation, and then it's bracing yourself. Is my ICD going to fire? A worry for parents with an inherited cardiomyopathy, if there are younger adults in the family getting on with their lives, going to the gym, but maybe a worry that doing too much heavy exercise might trigger an event, and parents being very anxious about their adult children getting on and living their lives. So young adult children doing marathons and parents kind of being very worried about them. A thought, I keep getting knocked down. This is another thing on top of other things. And a thought, I feel alone, nobody understands. Here's just an example of research. So this is old research. This is 22 years ago. It took place at St George's Hospital in London, and they interviewed 99 adults living with dilated cardiomyopathy. Their results at the time, they said, you can read it, patients with dilated cardiomyopathy reported significant impairments in physical functioning, in role limitations due to physical and emotional problems, their social functioning, so how they were functioning within their relationships, their mental health, their perceptions of their health, their sleep, and their general vitality. Anxiety and depression levels were higher than in population samples, so compared to the general population. And I don't know if that resonates, and I think for me that would be understandable, and I would recognize that in the people I see. It doesn't mean that everybody feels very anxious and is upset all of the time, but it certainly comes in waves, and it certainly is around the time of diagnosis or any changes in health or any interventions or surgeries or treatments. The stress level just goes up. Here's another study. This is in the Netherlands. They looked at emotional and behavioural problems in children with dilated cardiomyopathy. So this study is more recent. It's 2020. Their results, their key findings, they found in young children that they made more physical complaints in terms of their health, but they had fewer externalizing problems. By externalizing problems, they mean aggression or behavioural problems, so kind of outward expressions of distress. And they found no significant difference in anxiety and depression for those younger children compared to the general population. Now, in older children compared to the general population, so for children aged between 6 to 18 with DCM, they showed higher levels of depression and higher levels of anxiety. So for depression, 29% compared to 8% in the general population, and almost 20% for anxiety problems. And for me, that makes sense because as children grow older, they have more of an understanding, they can feel different from their peer group, they know they're going to hospital, they've got that growing insight. I think you see it more in teenagers when they understand more about their health condition, and you expect it to manifest itself in different forms of distress. Okay, just moving on, what I wanted to do is, because I'm very aware that for people with inherited conditions, the way you might encounter a diagnosis is through a sudden cardiac death within the family. And it's not only the shock of an untimely death and losing a loved one, but then it's the impact on the whole family in terms of traumatic grief. But then the whole encounter with hospital, genetic testing, understanding which members of the family might be affected, and then making sense of the results. So even if you do have something and you don't have symptoms, what does that mean for you? And how do you look after your health going forwards? I don't know if you've seen this. This is a bronze sculpture, and it's by the side of Lake Geneva. Has anybody seen it? So this is by an artist. The name is at the bottom, actually. It's just down there. It's called Melancholy, and it's Albert Georgi. And it's a sculpture that he developed after he lost his wife. And he wanted to really represent that terrible void that he felt by his wife's absence. And he wanted to demonstrate that in this bronze sculpture. And I think it was put on Facebook and it went viral because so many people, it resonated for them that just the grief of losing somebody that you love, and not only the void within yourself, but also the sense of isolation and the loneliness and the pain. This is a psychologist called Roland Katchler who lost his 16-year-old son died, and he talked about he's a psychologist, and he talked about his personal experience of grief, losing his 16-year-old son. And I think what's different about Roland, the literature around grief, that there's often an idea that you have to let somebody go. Over the years, you grieve and you let them go. And what this psychologist said, it's not about letting somebody go. It's about how do you maintain a relationship with someone and continue that relationship with someone even though they're not present in your life. So this is what Roland said. He said the first year is about surviving the shock. It's surreal, and the prevailing feeling is numbness. Moving towards the first anniversary, pain and grief increases. The first anniversary is like a gate into grieving. The second year is an intense year of grieving as realization sets in. As numbness fades, we become more and more aware of the reality of death. And the third to fifth year is the time we transform with and through the pain and grief. The bereaved live in two worlds, the world of the inner relationship with the deceased, as well as our daily life. This is a study. It was carried out in Stockholm, in Sweden. In this year, actually, it was published. And they interviewed 12 family members. The title of the study was Losing a Close Person Following Death by Sudden Cardiac Arrest. And it's bereaved family members' lived experiences. And I'll just talk through the findings. So there are a number of themes that they identified through this research. The first theme is, so this is family members who may have been present during CPR, or who may have been at the hospital, or who were around. They might not have witnessed it, but they were around. So one of the themes was the hope of family members, their experience that fluctuated between hope and despair during CPR. Needing to know that everything possible was done for their loved one, being left with some questions. They didn't get answers to necessarily all of their questions. Seeking consolation in the sudden nature of the death in cardiac arrest, and just with the comfort of knowing that the person didn't suffer. Sudden thoughts about death really prompted them to think about their own fragility of life. And again, encountering mortality. And the idea that really that grief comes in waves. This is what one person said. I thought I was having a heart attack, so then they told me it was stress and anxiety. I would wake up in the middle of the night and feel my heart beating. I was calmer simply finding out that I wasn't having a heart attack. So that challenge of working out what's physical, what might be to do with your cardiac condition, and what might be the impact of stress. Okay, acceptance. This is research, the effect of acceptance of illness on the quality of life in patients with chronic heart failure. I'll just draw your attention to the conclusion. The extent that a patient accepts their chronic heart failure diagnosis has been shown to impact on their quality of life. So there's a relationship between acceptance and your experience of day-to-day life. Now, just going back to the type of therapy, it's called acceptance and commitment therapy. It's very much based on the idea of acceptance. If you want to read more about it, I recommend it. There's a good book by Russ Harris. It's called The Happiness Trap. It's easy to find, but it will tell you more a bit about this. So acceptance and commitment therapy is really recognizing that we might feel anxious or angry or sad, that these are painful emotions. But sometimes when we try to get away from these painful emotions, it doesn't help us feel any better. So acceptance is about really allowing ourselves to feel emotions and sitting with them. So for example, emotions, sensations, urges, or if we have flashbacks, it's really the idea of, rather than trying to make them go away, is to allow space within our bodies, within our minds to feel them. So it's almost, maybe it goes against common sense, I don't know if it does. But it's allowing yourself to be in contact with some of the painful emotions that you might be experiencing. And finally, just touching on what helps. So just following on from that, making space for emotions. So really recognizing the purpose of emotions. Emotions give us information about our bodies, about our situations. If you feel an emotion in a situation, it's probably for good reason, so pay attention to it. Understand what might the emotion be helping you to understand, and use the energy of the emotion. So you can use the energy of anger, you can use the energy that's linked to anxiety to do things that are meaningful for you. So one way of doing this is just to think to yourself, what am I feeling now? Identify the emotion, name it. How might this emotion be helpful for me? Making room for it, and also thinking a bit about using a metaphor. You can think about yourselves as the sky, your body as the sky, yourself as the sky. And noticing that emotions will come and go day to day, maybe throughout a day, different emotions will come. But you can just allow them to be there, notice them come, notice them go. And it's really the idea that you can observe them, but allow them to be present. What else helps? Simple, relaxed breathing. Focusing on the out-breath as you breathe out, think in your mind of the word relax. So slowing down your breathing, not particularly changing your breathing, but if you just do it now, every time you breathe out, just think in your mind of the word relax. You're going to go to sleep now, aren't you? But also muscle relaxation. So when we get stressed and anxious, we have muscle tension in our shoulders, in our jaw, around our eyes, just within our faces, behind our faces, and within our abdomen. So what you can do, just do it now. Just check in with your body. Do a scan within your body. Can you see, is there any tension there in any of your muscles? If there is, just relax those muscles. So relax your jaw, relax the muscles around your eyes, relax the muscle around your mouth. Just think about your shoulders. Put your arms and hands in a comfortable position. Relax your abdomen, relax your legs and your toes. So that's just simple muscle relaxation. We know it's very effective, and it is a counter against stress. You can imagine yourself within a neon glowing protective bubble. You can choose the colour, and just within that, just go to your favourite place. You can just close your eyes for a few seconds. Don't do it now because I will definitely lose you. But just go to your favourite place in your mind, and that will have a relaxing, it's a buffer against the stress that you're experiencing. So these are very simple techniques. And the last one I just want to show you is it's cognitive diffusion. So you might have the thought, I'm a burden, I'm worthless. So you might be hooked up into that thought, and that will be having an effect on your adrenaline levels, on your mood. But what you can do, and I just want you to just do this for a moment as an experiment, hold in mind, even though you don't think this, hold in mind I'm a burden and I'm worthless. And just notice what it's like to have that thought in your head. What's the tone of that thought in your head? What does it feel like to have that thought in your head? Now, I want you to do this. I want you to have the thought in your head, but this time become an observer of having that thought in your head. So I want you to be in the position where you're observing. So I'm noticing that I'm having the thought that I'm a burden and worthless. So be an observer of you having the thought, I'm a burden and worthless. And now notice the emotional, when you do the noticing, notice the emotional tone. When you're in that position of an observer, of noticing yourself and noticing you having the thought, notice what it feels like to be in that position. We can talk about it afterwards. So when you notice yourself having the thoughts. And this was, when I did this on the PC, this was a little fish swimming around, but it doesn't work on this computer. So I've just left them there. But it was really the idea that thoughts will come and go, like little aquarium fish. Emotions will come and go. We can observe them, and we don't need to get hooked up with them. Okay, just in case you don't know, you can Google NHS talking therapies. In England, there are the IAPT therapy services for anxiety, depression, but also there's a list of psychological problems that you can get support with. They also do help with people living with physical health conditions. And just to say thank you very much for listening, and happy to discuss any of the points that raised, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. I could certainly relate to so much of that, as I'm sure can everybody in the room. We've got just about 10 minutes for questions, so sorry, not long, I'm afraid. But before we go on to questions, just to remind everybody that the charity has many, many resources for helping with mental health. So please remember, we've got the support nurses, we've got the peer support volunteers, we've got the support groups, we've got the coffee, we've got the Facebook groups, the coffee and catch up. So yeah, there's no need to ever feel alone. So with the questions, please, I'm sure there's lots, please keep them brief, and please try to keep personal details about the condition and treatment out of it, because this is being recorded. So yeah, if people pop their hands up, I will bring the mic to them.
My question is an observation, really. You mentioned perception and the list of emotions, like everybody, initial shock when you diagnose and all the rest of it. But my emotion was frustration at other people's perception of me as an individual. And 3 years ago, I did a talk about perception of an invisible illness. And it was, people think, when you tell somebody you've got a migraine, everybody's at the alcohol headache, so they can understand migraine. But when you mention cardiomyopathy, they don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And it's, well, you look fine, you were able to stand up.
Yes.
And the weight you carry inside when you've got that, people can't see it.
Yeah.
And I feel, not being sexist here, but I always felt every time you tell a woman about it, it's man flu. You know, it can't be that bad as it's not as bad as having a baby, is it?
Yeah.
You know, so, I mean, it was just the observation that frustration was the one that now I'm lucky now because I've had a transplant 2 years ago, so my cardiomyopathy is history. There was just an observation on that one, that of other people, the way they perceive you when you're going about your business and wondering why you were not doing what you were doing a few years ago or yesterday, for example, because you have up and down days. No. So that was just a thought on that one.
No, I think you've articulated it beautifully, because I think with a lot of health conditions, they're not generally well known. I think the cardiomyopathies fall into that. So other people, they won't understand it, they won't know what it means for you, and then what's your experience like when you're talking about it. But also, you're right, it's not visible on the outside. So if you're wearing a sling, or you've got a walking frame, or if you've got oxygen, these are visible signs of illness. But you look really well, and you look really fine. So, but also the psychological impact is not visible. I don't think it's ever really visible. And most of the physical impact isn't visible. So I think it's not well understood. And then it's what's that like, having social discussions with people's responses. And people, I think what's amazing about human beings, People are very good at giving advice when they know nothing about your condition. It doesn't stop them giving you advice and kind of making comments which may be helpful or unhelpful. But no, it's a very good point. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. I just wanted to ask, what's the best way of determining the kind of therapy that you need? Because you've talked about some of the emotions that you can have and maybe reliving past experiences or trying to deal with them or just talking to someone. And I've looked on websites before and you see the number of therapies out there, and it seems like there's 20, 30 different types. So what's the best way to know what you need?
Yeah, it is tricky. And I think when you meet a psychologist or a therapist or a counsellor, it's a bit about, do you feel comfortable with that person? Do they seem to be sensitive? Do they seem to show understanding of your experiences? Is there that connection? What are their qualifications? But I guess the therapists that have got some good evidence in terms of, say, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress are cognitive behavioural therapies. EMDR, I don't know if you've heard of EMDR. So that would be for traumatic memories. So, for example, something connected to being in intensive care, having a complicated surgery, or having an ICD shock, or having more than one shock. Those would be traumatic memories that get laid down. So activating the memory and doing bilateral eye movements it's very effective in terms of helping process that memory and stop it being so upsetting. And acceptance and commitment therapy, it's got very good application in terms of supporting people living with physical health conditions. Yeah, I do recognise that it's not so easy to find the right help with the right person, locally, in local areas.
I'm really curious. You shared the research around the higher levels of depression and anxiety in people with cardiomyopathy. In your experience, though, like compared to the general population, me personally, I find that people are more resilient who have had health conditions compared to the general public when it comes to COVID being a prime example. Everyone went into meltdown except those of us who are used to having restrictions on our lives. Do you see more resilience in health condition groups of people compared to the general population in general, or not so much?
Yeah, no, I reckon, because in a way you've dealt with challenging circumstances in your life, and you develop skills and strength in terms of you've encountered them and you have to get on with life. So you learn skills around managing and carrying on. You've also encountered mortality, whereas for most of the population, they were prompted to face their mortality during the COVID pandemic. But for a lot of you, you have been thinking about your own mortality and worrying about death for a long time. And you get to new places with that psychologically and also in terms of your daily routines and your health behaviours. So you're absolutely right to say, in a way, it wasn't new to you and you were used to dealing with some of those challenges. So I completely agree. And I think it's something, what's recognised in the research literature are the strengths and the resilience that comes out of having to deal with difficult circumstances in life. So we grow, and it's the silver lining of having really tough experiences. You learn how to navigate, you learn how to manage, you learn skills, and you can apply those in different areas of your life. Yeah. I think the only thing I would say about something like the pandemic is that when you're living with a health condition and you perceive yourself potentially to be vulnerable in terms of COVID, and you're already living with a heart condition, you can feel more vulnerable and more at risk. So the threat of death and the worry increases, as I'm sure it did for a lot of people living with physical health conditions. You just perceive yourself potentially to be vulnerable because it was unknown and we didn't know. Now we know that there was no more vulnerability for people that were generally day-to-day physically well, but we didn't know at the beginning of the pandemic. So yeah.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for the talk. It's very interesting. My younger brother and I both have ARVC, and we talk a little bit about the pendulum between feeling cursed and it being a gift, because sometimes we feel that the whole family's been affected, but also the fact that we know that we can manage our lives and educate those around us. So that kind of pendulum.
Yes.
I think this lady was saying it does make you quite strong, but also
Yeah.
there's a big shift
Yes.
in where you feel. So That's just an observation.
No, that's a really helpful idea to kind of recognise that it can feel different at different moments in time. So at one point in time, you can feel I've got this kind of extra burden and extra stress, and also it's the burden of knowledge. If you've done genetic testing and you know, there's then anxiety connected to the knowledge, even though physically you're fine and you're okay, but just the intellectual knowledge is a psychological burden. But then it does give you control and choices, and you know what you're dealing with. But I think it's managing the reality of your biology, isn't it? And getting on with life within that. And it's that whole thing around, it's very dynamic. It changes. It's not that you get to a place where you're sorted and then you're fine. It kind of comes and goes. You can have amazing days. You can feel really knocked down by it on other days. Sometimes, the washing machine can break down and you can kind of just feel really overwhelmed, but it's not about the washing machine. It's about kind of the background stress that's just been there, and that's the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's really useful. I just wanted to say that in my mind, when I was diagnosed, I got used to the idea of sort of dropping dead one day.
Yeah.
And I was fine with it, actually. And then I had an ICD fitted. And now everything's rearranged,
Yes,
I'm kind of thinking
yes.
like I'm having to sort of readjust
Yes.
to this idea, which I know probably sounds a bit mad.
No,
but
it doesn't.
it's more difficult thinking like, well, as you said, when is it going to go off?
Yeah.
Am I going to die with that or not? It's actually, and it's almost like you had the ICD fitted and then you don't get any, that's it, bye, off you go.
Yeah.
It's only today with you that
Yeah.
you've sort of even brought up these things, because I haven't had any, you just sort of have the ICD fitted and off you go.
Yeah.
Aren't you lucky? Bye.
Yeah.
And then
You're
it
kind of
kind
on your
of
own.
leaves you
Yeah.
with this
Yeah.
thing.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's a good example of the psychology around some of, living with, but then changes. So have a new bit of treatment, have a device fitted, and then there's new psychology around that. And then how do you adjust and get to a good way of kind of functioning in your mind and coping with this new set of dynamics? So with having the ICD in place, and then the prospect of shocks, which are really difficult. As much as they're life-saving, which is wonderful, the shock is not pleasant, and it has a psychological effect, and it's traumatic stress when it goes off, whether you're awake or whether you lose consciousness. It's a trauma. And then after, if you've had a shock and you wake up, you're very hypervigilant, you're on edge, and you feel really jumpy, and that's post-traumatic stress. So this is not easy living with these advances in medicine, even though they do extend your life, but it's not that straightforward, and you don't necessarily get support with that, with the details of it. And I think as well, the transplant, the psychology of transplant, there's a huge psychology in transplant. We didn't go into that today, but there's a huge psychology in preparing, being on the waiting list, being on the urgent list. Am I going to get an organ? Am I not? Yes, I've got the call. Okay, we're going to the hospital, we're getting the organ, and then recovering after major surgery. But then the psychology of that, I haven't, as much as my old heart maybe wasn't great, I loved my old heart, and now I've got somebody else's heart, and whose heart is this? And so there's lots of psychological issues that are there as you're processing different bits of the treatment, and medication as well. If you start taking medication, that's a big psychological change. How do I feel about taking these meds? I like them, I don't like them. What are the side effects? So all of these little things have psychological aspects to them.
Right. I don't quite know how to phrase this, because it feels a little bit odd. But I'm sort of this year realising how difficult it is living with me. Because obviously you talked about sudden cardiac death. Now,
Yeah.
my experience with my dad was exactly the opposite. I watched him fade slowly over 8 years as his heart basically starved his brain of oxygen, and he just, one brain cell at a time, drifted off. And I kind of decided that I'm going to die doing something bloody stupid. And I just go out and do stuff, but as you can tell, wife finds it difficult, and I haven't realised how much I affect people around me. Till a big Ramstein Stadium gig in the summer, my daughter turned to me and went, if you keel over, do you actually want resuscitating or what? And we actually had the resus conversation.
Yeah, it's good.
Standing in a stadium bowl, you know.
Yes.
Basically, it was if you get me quick enough, you're going to get me back. Get me back.
Yeah.
If you're not getting all of me, then let it go.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's kind of that. I've got that kind of fatalism about it, but it's kind of tough on the people. It's tough on the people around me.
Yeah. Because in a way, I guess I'm sorry to hear about your father, and I think to witness somebody's slow deterioration and the suffering that goes along with that is really difficult, and caring and supporting, and then thinking, I don't want that for myself. So actually, I mean, that's where most of us would like to have a good life and then go quietly in our sleep, not be in pain, not to lose our kind of cognitive faculties. That's how most of us would like to go. Some of us do go like that. And that's I think, the comfort of thinking, I'm going to go out doing something amazing. But it sounds as if you might be you're living life to the full. But I don't think, we don't need to know what this gentleman is doing, do we? But I've got visions of him abseiling, and I'm like, oh my goodness.
Well, I think the stupidest one was probably bodyboarding in an Atlantic storm off Brittany.
Okay, so, but you're
Waves
living...
that big. What does it say about you're only really alive when you're right on the edge of... That moment
I've
when you're
heard
thinking,
surface.
I've really blown this, but you feel momentarily really alive.
But do you know what? I think it's all about, for any one individual, it is about family discussions, but it's about what makes life meaningful for any one of us. What's important to you? What are the things that you like to do? And doing them and living them for as long as you're here. And I really understand, going out and doing the stuff that's important to you, because I think when you're faced with your immortality, it changes your whole perspective on life. You rethink it all and you think, okay, what's important to me? If I've got 1 year left, what do I want to do? If I've got 5 years left, what do I want to do? None of us know how long we're going to be here for, so let's make the most of it while we're here. And I really understand that, but I understand the worry in the family that you might be bringing forward the end unnecessarily. Thank you for sharing that.
We've just got time for one last quick one, as we're at the end of the session.
This is just a thought. My family history is we lost my brother to sudden death. Most of the family have been affected, so I deal with it myself. I have my children. And so the psychology around a family who deals with it is quite difficult, because as a mother, my response is to protect my children, make sure they're all right.
Yeah.
But as a person who's living with it myself, I have to deal with the fear of that.
Yeah.
And sometimes that all gets a bit confused.
Yes.
And so you scare your children because you're feeling vulnerable.
Yes.
And so that's another sort of aspect of the familial stuff.
No, I thank you for sharing that. But I think you're absolutely right. It's, for any one individual, what's the psychology around that? But how does that psychology impact? If you're feeling more anxious, then you might be more protective towards the children. And it's based on a lived experience of traumatic grief, that suddenly you lost your brother and it was an untimely death. I'm feeling very protective, as parents are generally extremely protective of their children and don't want anything bad to happen. But it's heightened so much more when you've had a lived reality of losing your loved brother. But then how do you protect your children from that? But they want to live their life. And so these are complex dynamics that need to be worked out within families. Thank you for just sharing that. Yeah.
Anne-Marie, thank you so much. I'm sure there are lots more questions, but unfortunately we have come to the end of this session. Thank you also for all your questions. So if I could ask everybody now, please, to go back over to Broadgate, where Rita Sutton will be giving her closing remarks.